Right, so what sort of things were you into when you were growing up? What were you taught? What did you read? Because that forms the basis for how we first start to inform ourselves, doesn't it? It amazes me in a way that we grow up with stories as kids like Cinderella or Rumpelstiltskin, where the hero of the story begins in grinding poverty and then gets rich at the end. Happy ending, such as the emphasis placed on wealth. And as adults, or at least as a society, we become so indifferent to those less well off, not being the kind of society in the end that chooses to help people to improve their lives and to prosper, but instead kicks people while they're down and when they're in need of help and choose to look down on them instead as if they're taking something of value from us even. Shirkers versus workers, whilst we are taught to idolise those of wealth. The Times Rich list, for example, even though most of them are taking far more from us, from society, with their tax breaks and their offshore accounts and their non-dom statuses and so forth. We switched from fairy tales to newspapers as we grew up, or the equivalent of, depending on age, from the Brothers Grimm to the Brothers Barclay, Brothers Grimmer, in my opinion, so to speak, and any moral lessons we might have got from such early readings and other places, if we were well-read kids. I was a bit of a bookworm, Aesop's Fables or books on mythology, the lessons that were taught in those tales got told in those too. But they all get forgotten as we get older. We get hardened up by life experience. The fairy tale for many of us becomes a hellhole instead, especially in Tory Britain, and how society views you becomes measured by wealth and privilege instead of how a society treats its worst off, which is supposed to be the sign of a civilised society, as that is. But the sheer barbarism on showing comparison to two recent events regarding the haves and the have-nots really ought to be a wake-up call to a lot of people who have forgotten what it's like to feel empathy for those less fortunate than themselves, or give a damn about others, because right now, the media and global reaction from people in power are giving us an absolute masterclass in shamelessness that they've become, and what influence they've had on the rest of us for too long, just how poor an influence they've absolutely been. Now, on Sunday, a small submersible called the Titan, this is as a rule a research and survey vessel, but if you can afford the $250,000 price tag of a ticket, it can be used for tourism too, and it was on a tourist trip down to the Titanic when all contact with it was lost. Now, the news coverage of this has been absolutely ridiculous. It's been insane. The BBC spent half the airtime of its most recent bulletins on just this one story. The US Coast Guard is out all over the place looking for it. The papers are offering blow-by-blow timelines of what's happened from one moment to the next to the 5 people stuck on the craft, consisting of the pilot, the CEO of the diving company, a British explorer, and a Pakistani multi-millionaire and his son. You genuinely think it was the only issue on the planet right now. And the cynic in me can't help but wonder the coverage of this incident is down to the need for distraction from the day-to-day hell of what's been happening in our domestic news. But another disaster happened last week too, and that hasn't got anything like the coverage. So if the British press were in need of a distraction to cover for the Tory government, why did they not cover this story in depth too? Although perhaps this one hit too close to home. You see, last Wednesday, so several days before some very rich people sank on a jolly to the Titanic, the second worst migrant boat sinking in terms of loss of life in recent history happened in the Mediterranean, as an overloaded fishing vessel carrying migrants capsized in Greek waters. More than 500 people are believed to have died, not least more than 100 children who were confined to the hold. 104 survivors have so far been rescued, no women and no children have been amongst them, and so far just 81 bodies have been recovered. People are out there currently pulling them up as they're going fishing. They're pulling up human bodies in their fishing nets. What a harrowing experience that must be for people just going out there for their livelihoods. The boat was apparently heading to Italy. It was allegedly being towed by Greek authorities, though they deny this. They claim the people on board were offered help and refused it, yet Greek activists spin a different tale, saying the boat inhabitants were pleading for help for 15 hours and didn't get it. There needs to be an investigation, but migrants again, who's willing to do it? Many of the people on this boat were coming from Pakistan, so in both instances we have Pakistanis involved. The fact one was rich and lived in leafy Surrey, and the rest were fleeing abject poverty, prepared to risk their lives for the hope of something better, notwithstanding, of course, certainly not to our media and the coverage of both incidents. The migrant boat sinking predated the sub. It still didn't get a lot of press, despite the massive scale of the loss of life. But when it's 5 rich people, though, wall-to-wall coverage. Today, banging is being picked up. Banging is the big story today. Banging is apparently being picked up from the sub. And that apparently takes precedence over so much of the other stuff happening in the news. Certainly over an update on rescues or bodies being found in the Med. Just keeping the tension on people paying attention to one story and ignoring the other. But every time I hear another update on this sub-incident, all I hear is a story where a handful of rich people are prioritised over a disaster involving hundreds of migrants. There shouldn't be any prioritising. Why should 5 people be more newsworthy than 750? Because apparently in our society, in our Western ideology, they're worth more. It reinforces the attitude towards refugees that is promoted by mainstream media, that they are somehow less important, less valuable, less than human in effect, that they don't matter. I did think there was a bit of arrogance when the sub named Titan, so similar to the name of Titanic. I did wonder if it was somewhat tempting fate going to visit the wreckage of such a similarly named ship. A ship that was arrogantly declared unsinkable, of course. A ship that also carried the haves and the have-nots, separated as they were. They were referred to as passengers if they were rich. They were referred to as steerage if they weren't. The attitude of the media, the coverage of this incident, Western attitudes full stop here and now, show actually the attitudes back in 1912 really haven't changed that much by 2023. That if you're poor, then that is somehow your fault and you are worth less as a human because your value as a human seems only to be measured by the size of your bank balance and the size of your material wealth. If the people on the sub do perish, and I certainly do not wish that upon them, that is not the point of this video. But the same hubris that existed in 1912 might also be the cause here. Apparently the Titan sub was the subject of a lawsuit regarding the depths it could safely dive to. An employee was fired over this for pointing out the forward viewport was only certified to pressures found at up to 1,300 meters. The owners, Ocean Gate, wanted to take it down to 4,000 meters, which is the approximate depth of the Titanic, beyond the certification of the viewport, and Ocean Gate refused to pay for a viewport to meet that standard. Cutting corners, cutting costs, capitalism, the greed is good mentality. Ironically, may have struck again, it would seem. If the viewport has failed, then all on board the sub, which is still yet to be located, will have died instantly, but most of all preventably. I mentioned the US Coast Guard is out looking for it as well, but even if they find it, they can't apparently rescue it. Submarine rescues can only apparently be performed by the Navy, and apparently their equipment can only reach as far down as 600 meters. In essence, therefore, these people, if still alive, are unrescuable, which begs the question why such tours are even permitted and why claims of rescue being possible at such depths are false. Will we see a cover-up of this, in which case? Fundamentally, however, it seems clear that the difference between exploration and desperation is one where you pay cash and for the other you risk your life over. And our capitalist society, even through our media coverage, places money above life. Your worth is measured through your material gains, when we don't get the same reaction to both incidents, both tragedies. And after you've liked, shared and subscribed to the channel, as I sincerely hope you will, if you appreciate my plain speaking way of presenting the stuff we too often don't get told, the attitudes to migrants here in the UK are a little better than that in the Mediterranean, as this ought to put Sunak's stop the boats policy in a bit more perspective as the act of pure evil it actually is, as the danger it is to people, as this video recommendation here will attest to. And I hope I will see you on the next video. Cheers, folks.